Good morning and welcome everybody. Bonjour tout le monde. Hola. Good afternoon in Chile, good evening in Asia. My name is Jeff Nankerville and I am the President and CEO of the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. And it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the fourth in our series of joint seminars between the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada and the Chile Pacific Foundation. And today's topic is China's Belt and Road Initiative and its foreign policy implications. I'd like to start off with an acknowledgement that wherever we are in Canada, the places that Canadians call home are the traditional territories of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. The APF Canada headquarters, where I am today, is on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are grateful to Canada's Indigenous peoples for their stewardship of the land, and we are collectively committed to the process of reconciliation. And I would remind our audience in Canada that this Thursday, for the first time, we have a national holiday for truth and reconciliation, and we will be marking that here in our offices in the foundation. We'll be observing that holiday. As I mentioned, this is the fourth in a series of webinars between APF Canada and the Chile Pacific Foundation. We signed a memorandum of understanding in 2019, recognizing the potential for mutual collaboration between our organizations. We both have a commitment to promoting dialogue and strategic engagement between our peoples and the Asia Pacific. And the webinar series was set up to identify a number of areas where our interests could be amplified in light of the changing geopolitical realities of the region, developments in trade architecture and governance, the development of digital trade, and we've had a special focus on regional engagement with the countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And today's topic, the impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative on foreign policy, looks to be the most popular. I think a combination of people enjoying and benefiting from the first three seminars in the series. We have a record audience registered for today's session. We've just hit 400 people registered. For those who missed the earlier sessions in season one so far, we've had a discussion on the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and Southeast Asia, looking at best practices for Canada and Chile and partnerships that we can develop in approaching the region. Secondly, a session on ASEAN and geopolitics, looking at the impacts on member states of new geopolitical developments, the rising competition between the US and China, and the prospects for middle path diplomacy, which is of particular interest to countries like Canada and Chile, but also many countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And the third seminar was on the subject of digital trade in the Asia-Pacific, and looking again with a focus on Southeast Asia and the opportunities to develop digital trade and investment connections, looking at models for international coordination. And we were able to have a very close look at the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, that really pioneering agreement signed between Chile and Singapore and New Zealand that offers a very interesting model. These seminars are available on our website, and I commend them to you if you would like to get caught up with us. But today, we're focused on the Belt and Road Initiative. And, you know, there's a general perception of the BRI since it was first elaborated early in the last decade as an initiative of China designed to exert a geopolitical power. But seen from the region, there are many other forces at play and many other drivers and dynamics that interact with the Belt and Road Initiative in a region of the world that is growing quickly and in a region that has a demonstrated need for massive infrastructure investments. So it's important that we look at the impacts of infrastructure investments, and in the case of the Belt and Road Initiative, to look at aspects of the initiative and the implications that it has for institutional stability, the prospects that it brings for trade, innovation, and economic development. And for this reason, we have convened an expert panel to discuss these dynamics within the region and to look also at their impact on Canada and Chile in our respective foreign policies. A few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded. It is being hosted in English with simultaneous translation into Spanish, and you can access the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to switch languages. We encourage the submission of questions in the Q&A box, and technical support is available from Mandy Ng at the email box events@asiapacific.ca. And now it's my pleasure to introduce my counterpart and partner at the Chile Pacific Foundation, Madame Loreta Leighton. Loreta is the executive director of the Chile Pacific Foundation. She has also served as executive director of the APEC Business Advisory Council during 2019 APEC year. She is a former diplomat of the Chilean Foreign Service and has served at the Embassy of Chile in Argentina, at the Mission of Chile to the United Nations, and 2 years as senior advisor to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States. At the United Nations, she was elected Vice President of the Third Committee of the General Assembly and Vice President of the Commission on the Status of Women, in both respects representing Latin America in those bodies. She has a wealth of experience in international negotiations and affairs. It's been a pleasure in my first month on the job at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada to get to know Loreta and her team. And it is my pleasure and honor now to ask Loreta as the moderator to take us through the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for your remarks, which have provided a perfect framework to assess today's webinar topic, and also for the warm words that you have said about us, the foundation, and of myself. My name is Loreta Leighton, as has been said, Executive Director of the Chile Pacific Foundation. And let me stress how proud we are to team up with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada to carry out this series around different political and trade dynamics in Asia and the broader Asian region relevant to Chile's and Canada's international trade and political relations. At the Chile Pacific Foundation, we strive to encourage and promote public-private initiatives aiming to underscore the strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region to our country. And this activity that I have the honor to moderate is a top-notch example of the Foundation's objective. This said, let me introduce Mr. Ignacio Tornero, who will provide a brief scene-setting remarks on behalf of the Chile Pacific Foundation. Ignacio is an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of Chile, and sorry, I have my video off, sorry. There we are. Sorry, Ignacio is an adjunct professor at the Catholic University of Chile and an associate researcher at the Center for the International Studies of the same university. He's an outstanding expert in corporate and commercial legislation, mergers and acquisitions, as well as corporate restructurings and foreign investment flows. Ignacio is a recognized consultant to Chinese investors in Chile and to Latin American companies running business in China. Having introduced you, Ignacio, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Loreto. Muchas gracias, Jeff. Saludos a todos.
Thank you, Loreto, Jeff. Greetings to all. Good morning to all those connected from Canada. First and foremost, to thank the Chilean Foundation of the Pacific and the Asian Canada Foundation for the interesting invitation. Likewise, greet all the experts that will share their views on the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and implications in policy implications. BRI, One Belt, One Road, is probably one of the clearest manifestations of the change of approach of China in the world. It was a power that was only focused in external issues. We see that China starts to be a more proposing agent globally. Global governance is one of the 5 dimensions that David Chambaud approaches. Is China or not a global power? BRI refers in general terms to connectivity operations of countries to different areas, land, Silk Road, and one that is addressed to Europe. From the very beginning, BRI has placed this a central region, and there is a multiplicity of factors that allow to explain and understand the above. There is a vision. Everything under the sky explains a form of China relating to countries, especially to Southeast Asia. Every word under the heaven is no land. Likewise, you have the dimension of exploration and exchange of China through navigation. As some historians say, there is evidence that at least beginning in the 2nd century, Chinese were building ships, and navigators already were trading with Sumatra, Borneo in the year 45 before Christ. And this found the maximum expression in the first half of the 15th century. And we cannot but observe, according to data from the US, in 2019, the diaspora of China in the world is 45 million, and 70% is living in Asian countries, and 26 million in Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, and Philippines. Thus, the importance of China abroad and in Asia. There are several terms to refer to that situation: Wahang, Wagong, Wanchao. And the recent expression, we see the fluid relationship between China and Asian countries. In this way, ASEAN is the main foreign trade bloc for China, with $630 trillion, and for 2 consecutive years. In connection with foreign investment, this has been very interesting, going from 3.5 trillion in 2010 to 10.2 in 2018. And we would find several challenges regarding the BRI: the real technical support of dead hub diplomacy, and some geopolitical relations between China and certain countries of Asia. Although BRI is a policy that is about to be 1 decade since its inception, there is giant potential in the multidisciplinary relations of China with those countries. Now I give the floor to the speakers so that they can share their views in this sense.
Disciplinaria de China con esas economías. Ahora doy la palabra a los expositores para que compartan sus apreciaciones en este sentido.
Thank you so much, Ignacio, for your remarks, which perfectly frame today's topic. Let me introduce our first panelist now, Andrés Borges. Andrés Borges is assistant professor and coordinator of the Chinese Studies program at the Institute of International Studies of the University of Chile. He's also the coordinator of the postgraduate diploma in Chinese studies at the same institution. He previously served as a research associate at the Center for Asia-Pacific Studies at Fudan University in China. Professor Borges is a doctor in international politics from the University of Fudan and holds a master's in social and public policies from the University of Paris I. His main research areas are China's foreign policy and Sino-Latin American relations. He has published in indexed journals in these topics such as China, an international journal of Singapore, Asian Education and Development Studies of China, and Estudos Internacionais of Brazil, among others. Please, Andrés, you have the floor.
Thank you. Gracias, Loreto. Bueno, primero.
Thank you, Loreto. I would like to thank Loreto and Luis for their invitation and our colleagues from Canada. It is a pleasure to be here. And let me take a second to take my time to speak. Okay. I don't know if you can see my presentation right now. There it is. Okay, there it is. The idea of this presentation is to present a holistic approach of this initiative in the Global South, including Latin America. This exercise comes from several researches that I have been conducting over time, where through in-depth interviews, I have been testing the point of view of the Global South, especially in Latin America, towards the different initiatives, stimulus, and fractions proposed by China to the Global South. And the first thing that you can tell is that regarding the initiative is that Latin American counterparties do not have such a specific point of view about this. And when you go and look with the BRI initiative, there isn't such a specific policy connected. However, from the Chinese point of view, there is a specific strategy. Now, can we move to the next slide, please? Now, assuming these elements, where in terms of perception, the Global South does not have such a specific approach, we can connect it with a more holistic approach. And within China, they have set a holistic approach that works as a sort of umbrella that comprises certain objectives in terms of a large setup, including some projects that were funded before this initiative even existed. And this makes this approach even more holistic, and where the countries of the South Global has a more liquid approach. Now, talking about this umbrella, we can understand that the ways in which we want to link this approach are several. They comprise several layers and levels with different type of stimuli and goals. And the way in which they want to link more specifically beyond diversification has to do with networking in terms of interconnecting the different countries. Unlike other initiatives in modern days that work with a block-based approach and that include values and objectives. Here, these are more concrete stimuli that are directed in a more selective way and that expand to the different beneficiaries and countries that add up to the initiative. This is under a logic of financial diplomacy and also the different steps that have probably not been covered by the powers of infrastructure. And the objectives that China seeks are in several dimensions, where they want to get material security, natural resources, etc., but also establish certain trade routes to get to marketplaces, to deliver and receive products, and establish logistics and financial platforms that allow for it to deploy this influence in terms of using the Chinese currency and the logics of importing and exporting from this Asian country. So can we continue, please, with the presentation? Here, I'm trying to explain this in a schematic way where we can see the logic behind this holistic approach. We could say that the BRI initiative works as a large antenna that is supported by a great server that are the development banks that are mostly Chinese, with development international banks that co-fund these approaches. And then we have routers that are key partners both locally and internationally. Locally, but meaning infrastructure, connectivity, logistic companies, and internationally, these are the strategic partners that are the diplomatic partners that there are from the Chinese point of view that want to have a more complete connection with this BRI initiative. And these are the first countries that start signing the memorandums and go under this logic. And then we have the South Global that are countries that go beyond. So can we continue with the next slide, please? Under this logic of going in depth into this holistic approach, where we see the South Global approach being a bit more diffuse, we see that the key activities that start being broken down in this initiative have to do not only with financial diplomacy, but they have to do with the development of infrastructure. They have to do with the actors of regions in China from other areas of Southeast Asia, where we look at empirical regularity, and we also have academic exchange and authority exchange. The value proposal that this initiative tries to project has been focused around infrastructure and connectivity. That is a gap that most of the developing countries have. And that is done through this networking logic with blocks, where you say that you do not need to have this logic affinity to be part of it. And this allows countries to bet on getting infrastructure finance. And then within its value proposal, the way in which projects are valued is very important. There are several projects that have been funded by international entities in more traditional aspects. For instance, where you get co-funding by the World Bank or the International Development Bank, but you get Chinese development banks or the Exporting and Importing Bank, where it is applied with a more holistic approach, and it is focused on more local regulations of the countries being funded. And there are certain doubts around these projects that have to go and reduce the funding of these aspects. And one of these proposals, not explicitly, when you co-fund these, the countries that are participating assume that they will be able to access this large market of millions of inhabitants, and they can generate the raw materials for them. So can we continue with the next slide, please? Now, to close and to leave some room for discussion, I would like to say that under a logic of dialogue between the perception of this route at a South Global level and then the official proposal of China, we can see that both cases agree that it is an adaptive exercise. And we also see that both analysis units agree that the risk assessment has its variation. On one hand, there are initiatives and projects that are under the rules of international standards, and others are based on discretion logics that have led to several criticism from the international community. We must consider also that is a non-ideological instrument. There are partners with different profiles. There are networks that are focused mostly on trade exchange and generation of projects for infrastructure, connectivity hubs, financial, and others are focused on the extraction of natural resources and those types of funding. And finally, I would like to say that what evidence shows up till now is that this initiative works as an instance or as a tool that for China's foreign trade policy, the countries that sign memos are strategic partners mostly, and they have been supporting other Chinese initiatives such as raising the Asian Bank in infrastructure and investment, some other votings in multilateral aspects. And you couldn't fear that that initiative involves aspects that go beyond trade and economic issues. Thank you very much for your invitation once again. And if you have anything to ask, please do so in the chat box.
También en algunos casos hay un alto grado de convergencia en algunas votaciones en ámbitos multilaterales. Entonces, se pudiese inferir detrás de eso que también esta iniciativa conlleva ámbitos que van más allá de los aspectos comerciales y económicos. Bueno, me detengo acá. Muchas gracias por la invitación nuevamente y cualquier cosa lo podemos ver en las preguntas.
Thank you so much, Andres, for your presentation. I am sure that many of the topics you have just mentioned will trigger an interesting discussion with our audience during the Q&A. I will now introduce our second panelist, Dr. Jeff Reeves. Dr. Jeffrey Reeves is Vice President of Research for the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada. Prior to joining APF Canada, Dr. Reeves was the Director of Asian Studies at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Dr. Reeves has over 15 years direct experience living and working in Asia, including as an associate professor with the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in the United States, as a research fellow with Griffin University in Australia, and as a university instructor at Peking University in the People's Republic of China. Dr. Reeves has worked with the United Nations Development Program and World Wildlife Foundation in Beijing, and as a research assistant with the London School of Economics and Political Science, Asia Research Center in London, Dr. Reeves served in the United States Peace Corps from 2001 to 2003 in Kovet, Mongolia. Dr. Reeves has published extensively on economics, politics, and security in Asia, including the books Chinese-Japanese Competition and the East Asian Security Complex, Vying for Influence, Routledge 2016, Chinese Foreign Relations with Weak Peripheral States, Asymmetrical Economic Power and Insecurity, Routledge 2015, and Non-Traditional Security in East Asia, A Regime Approach, Imperial College Press 2015. Jeff, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. So I'd like to build on Professor Borges' comments to provide what I see as the main narratives around the Belt and Road Initiative. First in the West, and then in China, and then in the Asian region, specifically the Asia-Pacific region. My interests in doing so are to provide an overview of the current geostrategic discursive themes that we see in leadership, scholarship, and media statements, and to consider how these narratives affect regional dynamics. Now, I do this with the understanding that how states frame issues matters almost as much as the issues themselves, particularly as these narratives inform policymaking, strategic design, and long-term perspectives. How we think about issues affects how we behave. Narratives shape the reality within which we engage with other actors, and this is very much true within the Asia-Pacific around the Belt and Road Initiative. I want to start with my bottom line up front, or my overall thesis, which is that the divergence between Western and Chinese views on the Belt and Road Initiative is so large that it carries with it a real potential to contribute to conflict between the two sides and to undermine Asia's regional stability. Now, for Canada, one way to avoid being drawn into any conflict resulting from BRI misunderstanding is to look to the regional actors for guidance on how to think about the Belt and Road Initiative's overall effect in Asia. Now, Western views of the Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, and by Western views, I primarily mean Australia, North America, and European views, or those states that advocate an Indo-Pacific redesign of the Asia-Pacific, almost uniformly present the Belt and Road Initiative not as an integrated whole of government economic and industrial plan, as was previously described, but rather as China's long game, or its 100-year marathon, or as a grand strategic plan designed to increase Chinese influence within the Asia-Pacific and across the global South in particular. Let me give you some examples from a Western policy perspective. The 2020 United States Department of Defense annual report to Congress on China's security and foreign policy development, for example, mentions the Belt and Road Initiative a total of 46 times, all within a political and strategic context, and distinctly as a strategic tool through which China, and here I'm quoting directly from the text, seeks to foster closer economic integration with countries along its periphery and beyond, thereby shaping these countries' interests to align with the PRC's, while doling criticisms over the PRC's approach to issues it views as sensitive. Similarly, the European Parliament resolution on a new EU-China strategy, published this month, September 16th, 2021, classifies the BRI as, and again, I'm quoting from the text, China asserting a stronger global role both as an economic and foreign policy actor, which poses serious political, economic, security, and technology challenges to the EU, which in turn has significant and long-lasting consequences for the world order and poses serious threats to rules-based multilateralism and core democratic values. Now, built into these two narratives, which are largely representative of contemporary Western security, foreign policy, and economics writing on the Belt and Road Initiative, are a number of assumptions that I think are worth unpacking a bit further. The first is the assumption within the Western narrative that China uses the Belt and Road Initiative to shape other countries' interests in line with its own national interests, that its primary intentions with the BRI economic exchange is to develop influence over how these states conduct foreign and domestic policy. Western analysts argue China accomplishes this through tools like informal sanctions and embargoes, which we've seen in the case of Australia, Canada, Sweden, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, for example, and through BRI-related debt trap diplomacy, or the idea that China uses predatory economics to secure access to state-backed collateral, such as ports and natural resources. Now, the second point is the idea that China uses the Belt and Road Initiative to challenge the rules-based order, or to undermine democracy, and to dull Western hegemony in Asia as well as globally. Western analysts argue the BRI's subcomponents, such as the Digital Silk Road, BRI projects such as transnational rail networks, and BRI institutions like the Belt and Road Forum, are challenging Asia's existing order and advancing Chinese values and interests, which are inherently illiberal. The need to push back against all these forces sits at the heart of the Western Indo-Pacific narrative. Now, needless to say, China takes a different view on the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese analysts fundamentally reject the idea that China is a coercive actor, and instead argue that China's foreign policy behavior prioritizes stability, win-win relations, non-interference, and common development among all other issues. pointing to the tendency among Western powers, especially the United States, to use military force and or broad sanction regimes to achieve their diplomatic ends. Chinese analysts even question the fundamental logic of what in the Western narrative constitutes coercion, particularly as China has no record of using force abroad in the modern era. Now, where China has informally restricted trade with Western states and Western aligned states, and again, this is a Chinese perspective, not my own, they've done so as a defensive matter, not as a punitive action. On South Korea's THAAD deployment, for instance, Chinese analysts argue the missile defense system allowed the United States to spy on China, a situation, these analysts argue, that no country could accept on its direct border. On Chinese import restrictions on Australian goods, Chinese commentators argue Canberra was acting on behalf of the United States to damage China's international reputation and to undermine China's domestic stability through unverified claims and accusations. Now, Chinese analysts also reject charges of debt trap diplomacy, arguing that Chinese lending, whether through the Silk Road Fund or the China Development Bank, relies on commercial logic and adheres to international standards with respect to repayment. Chinese commentators further argue that there is a clear documented history of Western states and international financial institutions gaining control over states' strategic assets in places like Africa following loan default. China, rather, prefers its debt collateral in the form of bank accounts with minimum balance requirements, meaning China wants repayments guaranteed in cash, not assets. Chinese loan contracts in this respect are entirely in line with international standards, while Chinese loans tend to finance projects in the developing world that Western states and institutions will not. As with charges of foreign policy coercion, Chinese commentators see Western claims of debt trap diplomacy as nothing more than a smear campaign to undermine Chinese foreign relations within the global South in particular. Now, on the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese analysts reject Western criticism, arguing the initiative, far from a grand strategy for world dominance, is rather a strategic means to address China's domestic economic challenges through win-win foreign and economic relations. The Belt and Road Initiative provides a blueprint for how China can expand its overseas export markets, thereby allowing it to deal with issues of excess internal capacity, and identifying opportunities for Chinese investment in regional infrastructure in particular that can lead to common development across Asia. Now, first and foremost, the Belt and Road Initiative is a strategic means to integrate China's peripheral states in Northeast, Southeast, South, and Central Asia into the Chinese market, creating growth opportunities for both China's landlocked states and some of Asia's poorest developing states. Now, again, Chinese scholars argue investment through the Belt and Road Initiative finance projects within Asia in particular that Western states and institutions would not, and that the BRI's investment vehicles, such as the Silk Road Fund, operate with market principles, not strategic aims. China's Belt and Road Initiative in this respect is little different from South Korea's New Southern Policy, Taiwan's New Southbound Policy, and Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy, all of which contain industrial policies that use state-directed investment to promote regional interconnectivity and integration to promote national trade. That Western states criticize the former while supporting the latter, at least from a Chinese perspective, is further evidence of a Western double standards towards China and Chinese foreign relations. So we clearly see differences of opinion about how the BRI acts as a foreign policy mechanism between Western states and China. What's the view from the region? Now, in general, one sees pretty widespread support for Chinese BRI engagement among both Northeast and Southeast Asian states. In contrast to Western assumptions around China as a revisionist state, for instance, Asian narratives on China's BRI tend to identify it as an irreplaceable actor within the region and a critical partner for Asian states on sustainable economic development, infrastructure investment, climate change, and pandemic response recovery and preparation in particular. Now, while Asian discourse on China does indeed include the perceived need to work with Beijing to address areas where its foreign policy engagement leads to regional tensions, so too do these Asian narratives see China as part of any long-term solution, not just as the sole source of the problem. Now, on the nature of Chinese BRI engagement in Asia, for instance, Chinese states differ markedly from Western assumptions around China's rise and its potential to destabilize the Asian region. At least part of this disagreement comes from the Asian perspective that China is already Asia's predominant economic, political, and security actor, that it has in fact already risen. Now, regional polling from 2019 to 2021 shows us, for instance, that around 75% of Southeast Asians already see China as the region's most influential economic actor, and around 50% see China as the region's most important strategic and political actor. Polls show the United States is just at 7% and 30% respectively. Now, similarly, Asian barometer polling from 2017 showed that the vast majority of Northeast Asian actors, including South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, believe China is Asia's predominant power, both with respect to its hard power, its military capacity, and its soft power, its cultural appeal. Now, in addition to its perceived influence, polling shows that most Asia-Pacific states, 57%, view Chinese influence in largely positive terms. Indeed, under the Trump administration in particular, Asian states largely viewed China as a more stable, more responsible power than the United States. On free trade, a key component of the Western free and open Indo-Pacific concept, Asian respondents in 2020 identified China as more committed to the ideal than the United States. Now, when asked in 2020 whether they would align with China or the United States if forced to choose, 7 out of 10 Southeast Asian nations chose China. Now, while these numbers worsened somewhat for China in 2021, following the Biden administration's conceptual commitment to re-engage with Asia, polls still showed a high degree of approval, about 44%, for China's regional leadership, especially during the COVID pandemic, compared to relative disapproval for Japan at 18%, Europe at 10%, and at the United States at 9%. Now, more importantly, more than 40% of respondents predicted that their state's relations with China would improve in the immediate future. Now, more than any other poll, arguably, this registered sense of optimism towards China's future presence presents a stark break with Western narratives around the dangers that China's BRI poses to regional stability. Now, more than these polls, one sees Asian states and institutions implementing policy that is largely pro-Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. ASEAN member states, for instance, are working to link the ASEAN Community Blueprint and the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity with the Belt and Road Initiative to speed up ASEAN-Chinese cooperation in trade, investment, and production capacity for win-win cooperation. South Korea has also indicated an interest in linking its new Southern policy to the Belt and Road Initiative in order to give Korean multinational corporations like Samsung better access to Asian markets. Even Japan has expressed willingness to work with China through the Belt and Road Initiative. As former Prime Minister Abe put it, under the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, Japan believes that we can cooperate greatly with the Belt and Road plan touted by China. So what does this all mean for Canada and for Chile? Well, first, Canadian policymakers must educate themselves to alternative narratives around China's BRI, so as to avoid conceptual and operational alignment with Western assumptions, plans, and initiatives that securitize Chinese economic and political engagement in Asia. This does not mean accepting Chinese or Asian narratives uncritically, but rather that Canada needs to understand holistically how Beijing views its activities, how it views the criticism around its activities, and how Asian states see China as a regional actor. Second, Canada needs to incorporate these alternative views into a comprehensive foreign policy approach to Asia. Failing to draft a regional approach that takes Chinese and Asian states' concerns, beliefs, relations, and intentions into account is designed to fail. To ensure the longevity of one's strategic plan, one has to build it on as clear a picture of regional realities as possible. Third, Canada needs to find opportunities to engage in regional Belt and Road Initiative institutions that advance its national security and national economic priorities within Asia. Participation in the Belt and Road Conference, for instance, will give Canada a chance to learn from 29 of Asia's developing states, while also giving it a voice in an increasingly important regional venue for dialogue. Now, participation with China around an Arctic Belt and Road could provide Ottawa and Beijing an important opportunity for bilateral engagement around science and science, technology, and development, or climate change and conservation. An engagement with the Silk Road NGO cooperation network would give Canadian non-governmental organizations access to over 340 NGOs from across the global South. In short, a clear understanding of divergent views around China's BRI is critical for Canadian national interests and long-term regional stability. Rather than assume Chinese behavior and intentions, as is so common in Western narratives, it's our duty to spend time and energy to understand alternative perspectives. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for these enlightening words regarding BRI. Certainly new points of view, which will enrich our discussions, not only in Canada, but certainly in Chile. So thank you so much for that. And we will come back to some of your points in the Q&A session. I would like now to introduce to our third and last panelist, Elina Noor. Elina Noor is Director, Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director, Washington, D.C. Office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. A native of Malaysia, Ms. Noor's work focuses on security developments in Southeast Asia, global governance and technology, and countering violent extremism. Previously, she was Associate Professor at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. Prior to that, she was Director for Policy and Security Studies at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, Malaysia. While there, she also served as the Secretary of the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific, a 21-member Track 2 regional security network. Between 2017 and 2019, Mrs. Noor was a member of the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. She has also been on the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs roster of experts and is part of the Christchurch Call Advisory Network. Elina, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a distinct pleasure to be on this panel, so thank you for having me. As Jeff so incisively laid out, discussions on the BRI, especially here in Washington where I'm based, tend to be cast in this binary with a lot of details either glossed over, dismissed, or viewed through solely great power lens. So I thought I would frame my remarks over the next few minutes by trying to connect some of those missing or overlooked dots from a Southeast Asian perspective. I'll focus on 3 points: scope, agency, and digital connectivity. First, scope. One of the challenges of assessing BRI projects is actually determining what makes a project a BRI project in the first place. In a past life, I worked with some colleagues back home in Malaysia on a study assessing Malaysia's participation in the BRI. What we found interviewing officials, trade and industry representatives, as well as civil society members, is that the defining parameters of a BRI project are often unclear. Is it Chinese public financing that makes a project a BRI one? What about private investment projects? And these sorts of questions were not always answered categorically. Just because there is significant Chinese investment does not necessarily or automatically make a project a BRI one. Sometimes domestic political circumstances will determine whether or not countries choose to append the BRI label to a project. Large infrastructure projects like high-speed rail links or ports are often more obviously BRI joint ventures than others, especially when they are publicized as exactly that by both the Chinese and host governments. But I've also seen township development projects like Forest City in the southern state of Johor in Malaysia categorized as a BRI project in some websites. And I wonder what criteria was used to determine that. For those unfamiliar, Forest City is about a $100 billion property development project on 4 reclaimed islands off of the state of Johor and Singapore, between the Chinese company Country Garden and a subsidiary of the Johor state government. Forest City, the project, turned out to be a lightning rod domestically in the run-up to the 2018 Malaysian general elections. And because that made international news, Forest City was conflated as a BRI project in numerous commentaries, and it was made a barometer of Malaysia's position on the BRI and great power competition. Which brings me to my second point, agency, and specifically the agency of host countries. This, to my observation, has probably been the most undertreated, maybe mistreated aspect of BRI discussions. There is a tendency to paint host countries, many of which are developing economies, as naive, inept, or incapable of negotiating against this Chinese behemoth. The reality is, of course, a lot more complex, even if it's not always convenient for certain narratives. Studies by Lee Jones and Shahar Hameri for Chatham House, as well as Deborah Brottingham at Johns Hopkins, have shown that domestic priorities, interests, and in the case of the often quoted Sri Lanka as a Hambantota port, structural problems and pre-existing debts were and remain huge factors in a host country's decision to undertake infrastructure projects along the BRI corridor. Going back to the interviews my colleagues and I did on Malaysia's participation in the BRI, we found that when stakeholders, whether local, state, or federal government officials, assert applicable laws or regulations, or when civil society members push back on a project, Chinese investors will usually be compliant or willing to renegotiate. The East Coast Rail Link in Malaysia is an example. This link was realigned at a reduced cost from about $15 billion to $10 billion for domestic reasons, largely due to the 1MDB corruption scandal and its fallout when the Pakatan Harapan government took over in 2018. So the BRI is as much a learning curve for Chinese enterprises investing abroad as it is for host countries. And actually, in a number of more mature but still developing economies, there is more experience in dealing and negotiating with foreign investors and large infrastructure projects than there is among Chinese companies seeking investments abroad. Certainly, there is room for capacity building and training to negotiate some of these projects better and in a more transparent manner. And this can be supported by other partners in the region through countervailing or complementary, depending on how you look at it, initiatives such as the Blue Dot Network. But it's important to keep in mind that countries do have agency. And often it's domestic priorities or interests rather than a primary consideration of strategic alignment that determines just how much these countries exert that agency. My third and final point relates to digital connectivity. If you know Southeast Asia, you know that connectivity is a buzzword. There is even a master plan on ASEAN connectivity, accompanied by many other supporting regional and individual policies, strategies, and plans that run the gamut of tech-related jargon and acronyms from AI to IoT to IR 4.0 and blockchain. You name it, we have it in Southeast Asia. The region has one of the largest potential digital economies in the world. It's got some of the highest rates of internet usage worldwide. and its digital commerce market size is expected to reach about $200 billion in just about 3 years. Southeast Asia's digital market, and as well as its market of 650 million people, provides a major incentive for not just China to extend its digital reach by the digital Silk Road, but also other partners in the global north that have long invested in the region, partners like IBM, like Cisco, etc. Chinese tech companies have already begun investing a great deal and at different scales in Southeast Asia's digital commerce scene. And these investment projects run from sea, submarine cables, to space, satellite navigation systems, and from hard infrastructure to soft infrastructure like cloud storage and processing. Within ASEAN, it's estimated that Chinese investments in its combined technological sectors account for over 1/3 of Chinese tech investments across all BRI participating countries over a period of 9 years from 2007 to 2016. But here too, at the granular level, the picture is actually quite mixed. The submarine cable scene is a shared landscape between companies like Huawei Marine, but also Google and Facebook. Google and Facebook just announced a couple of cable systems that will connect Southeast Asia to the US via Taiwan, Guam, and Japan, among others. And on the cloud storage front, you have countries like Singapore emerging as a hub for these data centers. Alibaba and Tencent are present in the cloud service space, as are Amazon and Microsoft. Alibaba and Tencent have also invested quite heavily, as I mentioned, in regional homegrown unicorns like Grab and Tokopedia. And on 5G, there's been a lot of debate about this, as we all know, worldwide, but Huawei and Ericsson are present on the core and peripheral networks in different countries in Southeast Asia. And many of these decisions on 5G were made, again, due to primarily to domestic priorities, agendas, and interests, rather than any deliberate consideration of strategic alignment between the US and China. As China expands its Beidou satellite navigation system, though, it will be interesting to see how many more Southeast Asian entities sign on to it. Currently, Brunei, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Indonesia are among those who have agreements to use China's Beidou SatNav system. Now, Southeast Asian countries have made it quite clear that they are uneasy about a bifurcation of global relations due to these deepening tensions between the US and China. But as both these powers seek to decouple in the technology space, it will be really interesting and nerve-wracking in a way to watch out for how things develop in the evaluation of standards, technical standards, norms, and international law, or collectively this governance framework of technology in the coming years. If you remember, during the Trump administration, the US launched its Clean Network Initiative that very specifically targeted Chinese companies and the Chinese government. And in response, China proposed its Global Data Security Initiative, which actually seemed more appealing to many Southeast Asian countries because it came across as more inclusive. So this tech governance space is where Southeast Asian countries will find themselves increasingly squeezed, but it's also an area that they can really seek to carve out their own agency and articulate their priorities and interests, and some of which may converge with the major powers' interests, others which may diverge. There's a real opportunity here for Southeast Asian countries to develop and table their own proposals, ideas, and principles. There is, however, of course, a lot of work to be done in pursuit of that goal, given the digital divide in the region. And this digital divide spans infrastructure, it spans funding, intellectual capital. But this is also where partners like China, the United States, Canada, Japan, and others can and are already helping to support. There is also a parallel opportunity, and one still underexplored, to exchange insights within and among the regions and countries of the Global South on their respective experiences with the BRI more generally, but also on potential avenues for cooperation in helping shape a future, especially in the digital space, that's not an either or environment. So let me stop here and I'll be happy to explain more in discussion if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina, for this very interesting presentation, specifically on the last point, the digital one, that not much has been said. I would like to start with a question to you that has to do with the high debt that this BRI has come with when they get to invest in a country, in a new country. And you mentioned the case of Malaysia, which they had a high debt problem with China due to the BRI projects. And this is the question. Many critics underscore the high debt levels of many countries, with the Chinese under the BRI as the most dangerous phase of this program. In your view, how serious a problem is this both financially and politically? You mentioned that Malaysia managed to renegotiate the debt, but still there's a component in terms of political, how to say, engagement with China. Can you elaborate a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, some studies have been done debunking this debt trap diplomacy myth. And I think if you look at the details of not only Malaysia's projects on the BRI, but also with some of the other countries, Sri Lanka and some in Africa, you'll see that actually the debts that were created were not with China. In Malaysia's case specifically, the debt was a result of mismanagement, of corruption that the previous administration, prior to the one that took over in 2018, found themselves saddled in, or rather saddled themselves in, not so much a passive action, but it was a creation of the 1MDB and the financial scandal and corruption that erupted from that venture that resulted in an eventual renegotiation with China on some of the infrastructure projects.
Okay, thank you very much, Alina. I have a question for Jeff now. Your recommendations for the Canadian strategy are spot on. How confident are you that the government will follow them? What do you expect from Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy? And there's another question that I will just leave it on the floor as well for you. We haven't tackled this issue here, but it certainly is a new development. It has to do with AUKUS. Could AUKUS be a rushed answer to China wishing to join the CPTPP, the opposite, or are both events unrelated?
Those are great questions. Just aware that they take us a little bit further away from the Belt and Road Initiative discussion.
Yeah, the second one, yeah.
But certainly happy to take a crack at them. In terms of the Canadian government's policy deliberations, I personally don't have any insight into that process. We were on occasion asked to give our opinions to certain people on the policy side. Whether or not they take our opinions and how that figures into their deliberation processes, I wouldn't dare to speak. I really don't know that much. I know that Canada has been very circumspect and very thoughtful in approaching an Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific strategy through the lens of national interests in a way that I commend. I think that there has, of course, been a lot of pressure from Washington, in particular under the Trump administration, and pressure, indirect pressure that comes from the close partnership between Canada and Japan, to do some degree of alignment around a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think that the European adoption of an Indo-Pacific strategy as well, the French, the German, the British kind of global Britain approach to the free and open Indo-Pacific, all of these pieces are falling into place in a way that naturally put pressure on Canada to move in that direction. But the fact that the government hasn't come out and announced an Indo-Pacific alignment, or hasn't said we also see the world through this free and open Indo-Pacific lens, means that there's a degree of deliberation going on that I think is healthy for a policy process. They're thinking through the pros and cons of this construct in a way that I think is ultimately going to lead to stronger Canadian policy going forward. Rather than just view the world through the lens of Washington, I think there's a real effort within Ottawa and Global Affairs and DND to think about what are Canada's national interests toward the region, what are its national security priorities, and how can we best achieve those. So I hope that that's the way things are going. And I do think that the fact that we haven't had that clear alignment put into place does speak to a more kind of omnidirectional approach to managing Canada's relations within the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, if they end up taking that nomenclature. With respect to the AUKUS, what a horrible acronym. It's an interesting development, one that I didn't see coming. I really did think that the prioritization was going to be on strengthening the Quad, which again, I didn't see coming. I do think that there are some consequences to the AUKUS formulation that I don't know that the Biden administration or the Morrison administration in Canberra necessarily anticipated. Certainly the blowback from France was probably not something that they had internalized as fully as it was into their own calculations. I don't think that they expected France to recall ambassadors. I certainly don't think that they understood that Paris would be upset about losing a huge arms deal, but certainly I don't think they had the expectation that France would take it quite as personally as it did. We can talk about that as to, I think that's a fascinating dynamic of this Indo-Pacific kind of Western alliance that's going on in Asia. France really trying to carve out a space for itself as a Pacific power, and then seeing this move back away from Australia, which is one of the linchpins around the French approach to the region, really as a blow to its status within that region. But longer term, I think AUKUS is, I think the Malaysian Prime Minister came out and said it most clearly. This has the potential to lead to further regional tensions. This has a potential to lead to arms races. All of those things within the Asia Pacific, I don't think are necessarily net benefits. From an Australian perspective, this ties Canberra very closely to Washington, D.C. for the near future. There's not going to be a lot of strategic area for maneuverability within Australia's approach to the region. I think this is very clearly the first instance of a state within the Asia Pacific aligning with the United States over China. And I think that from that perspective, for Canada, Australia is a cautionary tale about what happens if you over-securitize the relationship with Canada. And that's not, or excuse me, with China. And that's not even considering the domestic implications for Australians of Canadian or Australians of Chinese origin, which is a big issue. The other thing I think that's interesting about AUKUS is that it shows the different approaches from the United States and China. And I know I saw that the other part of that question is China asking for the possibility of membership in CPTPP. What you're seeing here are two distinct strategic lanes where the Western world in particular is focusing on security and military cooperation and co-investment and joint training and joint patrols of the South China Sea and maritime security as the linchpin of their strategic approach, right? You see the UK sending aircraft carriers to the Asia Pacific as part of its Global Britain strategy. You see France doing the same thing with naval frigates. This is the cornerstone of the Western approach. On the other side, China and the CPTPP and the Belt and Road Initiative show very clearly that China's prioritized the economic or the socioeconomic or the political economic component of strategy. And those are two very, very distinct poles around which one can build a strategy. And I think if you look at Southeast Asia and you look at ASEAN, the member states of ASEAN are much more comfortable with looking at Asian order through the lens of economics than they are through security.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And sorry to put you on the spot with AUKUS, which is not a topic of this webinar, but definitely it's something that it has to be tackled somehow. It's just so recent and very, very important, as you say. It will have its consequences and we will have to look at them. I have another question. I don't know who wants to pick up this one. It comes from Narayan Kumar. He says, has any expert or body of experts carried out an analysis and assessment of the long-term impact of the BRI on the sovereignty, both political and economic, on the countries of the region? And specifically regarding to Latin America, what is China's interest in the progress and development of the countries of the region? There was another question that mentioned which are the real, well, another question that we wanted to pose, which are the real interest of China on social development in the region? I don't know who wants to pick up this one. Andrés?
I can try. Bueno, en términos oficiales, hay que considerar
in official terms, China has a historical interest with the global South. This comes from Mao through his view of intermediate paths or third path, third way. And that has been translated into financial existence, technology, and training. However, we could say that that initial drive with Mao Zedong went through a secondary stage during the more Hu Jintao and Deng Xiaoping with a more global strategy that have approached the West through international organizations and multilateralism dynamics. Currently, with Xi Jinping, there is an intermediate point or path where China, once again, is putting a focus or attention in their developing world in a much more active way than merely to go seek natural resources. That was the continuity of previous governments only. And that's in that configuration, it's this narrative of the third path or a third way towards development is being reinvigorated in the global South through the Silk Road. And that would set up this logic of not only seek natural resources, but generate financial logistic hubs and with a Chinese currency for financial operations or trades or investments without the US dollar, or the same thing in technological terms, seeking connectivity through fiber optics, 5G. And also there are exchanges in political coordination with China and CELAC, trying to establish a framework of direct dialogue similar to what it has been doing in Africa. So there is an interest of China in something more complex than merely interacting through security or natural resources seeking. There is an approach to diversify their own markets, testing and trying their technology, and generating strategic partners with the global South, with that narrative of establishing from there a third way and considering the tensions of China with Western powers, that through Deng and integration policy with open door policy and abroad policy had been mitigated by these economic variables and trade. Today, that is not that evident. And the way out China sees in order to continue inserting itself with the global South.
Para seguir insertándose en el escenario internacional con el sur global.
Muchas gracias, Andrés. Do you want to comment or complement this, Jeff, or?
I think that was an excellent answer.
Well, that's great. We have another question here regarding what you said, Jeff, that while the Western it's looking at security issues and focus on that part of the equation, and China is more in trying to the economic development or build another kind of ties. There's a question here that says, well, Jeff Reeves stated that China does not use force on other countries. How can he explain China's interventions, actual and potential, on Hong Kong and Taiwan, both countries distinguished nations since the 80s for the successful development based on free market economies? And also, let me add to that the recent tensions with India that they had well, they were fighting in the limit. So, what can you say about that, Jeff? That these are the part of China's foreign policy or whatever you can call it.
Okay, so I'm aware, acutely aware, that my new boss is the former Consul General for Canada to Hong Kong. So I want to make sure that I think through my comments, and I believe I'd be very interested in hearing his thoughts on this as well, as I'm sure they're well developed and very informed. One of the things that I would start with is, well, first of all, Hong Kong is not a country. It is a city, and it's a city that's been part of China historically, and then certainly since the handover in the 1990s, part of a long-term strategy of reintegrating into China. There was always the intention that Hong Kong ultimately would be gradually brought into a system within China over the course of decades, but of course Xi Jinping condense that timeline. One of the things that I think is interesting about Hong Kong that is very timely for this discussion, and again, it brings in the importance of seeing things through the lens of Chinese perspectives on certain security issues, is as of yesterday, I think it was the day before, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a 100-point list where they identified American involvement in Hong Kong to slander, vilify, smear, and undermine government institutions within the Hong Kong region, and used that 100-point list to justify the imposition of a national security law from Beijing on Hong Kong, with the understanding that it was necessary in order to bring stability. And if you do think back to 2019 and 2020, when there were large protests across Hong Kong affecting everything from transportation to education to the commercial viability of the city, a lot of people within Hong Kong do see the stability around the national security law certainly problematic with respect to issues like freedom of expression and freedom of protest, but also in positive terms with respect to stability within Hong Kong. So I'd say that's the first point that I'd like to make. It's not a country, it's part of China, and China has long seen it as part of a kind of a colonial legacy of the century of humiliation that China experienced when it was a weak power and Western states came and took advantage of that weakness to essentially carve away at its sovereignty. Taiwan is a similar construct. I am happy to call Taiwan a country. I think it has all the modern trappings of a sovereign nation with respect to international sovereignty, domestic sovereignty. It does not have international sovereignty with respect to being recognized by other countries or being parts of the international community, simply because of the complexities around Taiwan PRC relations. But from a Chinese perspective, they don't see it that way. They see it as part of China. They see it as a province that has been carved off, the result of an ongoing civil war that's never been resolved. And I think from the Chinese perspective, they would say that they haven't used force in bringing Taiwan back into some sort of coerced position with the mainland, that their strategy has been much more focused on developing influence within Taiwan and long-term stable relations to bring Taiwan naturally back into a Chinese kind of greater China construct. One of the things that you would hear from a Chinese perspective, however, is that it's the West that's changing the status quo in Taiwan, and particularly the Trump administration, with these small incremental policies about recognizing and normalizing US-Taiwan relations, with allowing active ambassadors to travel to Taiwan, with changing the name of the US office in Taiwan to more formally recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state or nation. These small incremental movements on the West are moving the needle on the status quo to a degree that Beijing feels that it has to be more proactive around making sure that Taiwan doesn't move too far down the road towards independence. And so from a Chinese perspective, it's been measured, and it's been the West that's the one that's been the provocateur in this situation. With respect to India, again, it's an issue of sovereignty. That wasn't China using force outside of its country as much as it was using force to back up its sovereign claims over an area that's been an ongoing territorial dispute with India for a number of decades. And from the Chinese side, again, that's a defensive posture rather than an offensive one, which is the big difference between how the West uses military power overseas and how China uses its armed forces.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for clearing up this. Most of the people or our audience may be informed through the media, and definitely there's a lack of information. And so this is a really good insight information. I have another question that I don't know if it could be for Elena or any of you. What is the role of middle powers such as Canada and Chile in this increasing competition for infrastructure financing in Southeast Asia? Maybe there's a room for financing or participating in the digital integration or that part of the silk, the digital space. I don't know how you call it, digital. No, I don't know how you call it, but what is there a role to play there for our countries, Canada and Chile?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we know from stats from Asian Development Bank, for example, that the infrastructure gap is about a few $100 billion per year for Southeast Asia. And it's a huge gap as well in the digital infrastructure financing space. So definitely there is a role for middle powers. The digital infrastructure space has so far been stopgapped to a certain extent by private companies. But there is also always an opportunity for companies from Chile, from Canada, elsewhere to invest in the region, especially since so much of the region, as I mentioned, is anchoring its future in the digital space. Apart from the financing piece, though, I think there's a real potential for capacity building in the intellectual and human resource space. There is still a lack of awareness about how some of these, as I mentioned, governance frameworks are evolving in the international arena. And the more conversations we have among countries in the global south about how to align our positions or distinguish our positions from those of the others, then the more we can articulate our positions more effectively at the international level from smaller countries.
Thank you very much, Elena. And indeed, at least the government of Chile, since last year or a couple of years ago, now with the pandemic, it's like last year didn't exist, but they've been prioritizing to strengthen our links with the Asian countries, building up new links in terms of cultural, political, economical, seeking for new markets, etc. So at least for Chile, that is one of, and we're trying to see and settle ourselves in another connection with the South-South, as you say, and try to build a new era of cooperation. And continue with the question about countries in Latin America, apart from Chile in this case. Which countries in Latin America are being seen by China as its strategic partners, and why so far? I don't know who can tackle this question.
Okay,
Andres?
I will try it. Thank you for the question. So I also will connect it with a complementary approach with the Elena that already mentioned. So, en español. Bueno, la estrategia china, como les mencionaba, se
The
basa
Chinese strategy is based basically on networks, and they work with targeted stimuli. And they do a tracking process, and there is basically an economic and trade network. Another network has to do with natural resources and access to critical resources. And there is another network that is based on ideologies and narrative. Now, assuming those different baskets, there are specific profiles that could be articulated to activate this BRI in our region. There are countries before the trade war with the United States that had worked as hubs. Chile was the first country in the region that established a financial hub to liquidate the RMB and use the Chinese currency in this sub-region. Then we can see the case of Peru, where through the financing of the Chancay port, which is a multimodal port that was funded basically by China, became a platform to receive food and some minerals from Brazil, Bolivia, from Chile then, and became a platform within this route where some infrastructures work and also a connectivity logic. And then Chile, at some point, through an initiative coming from Chile in this BRI, established a strategy to have a fiber optic cable that connected China with South America through this digital hub that has been reconfigured through several reasons. And then in Central America, Costa Rica was a strategic point in terms of a hub. And then in the most industrialized countries, we can mention Brazil for products. There are countries that are activating this route from a narrative point of view, but also in strategic terms. That's why I went to the point from before the commercial war or the trade war. Then after that, the BRI is being securitized at an international level, and that is going more into our region. There are some countries that were part of a strategic association, and now they are analyzing several factors because there are tensions that could lead to certain implications. And I connect this with Alina's argument where she's saying that countries they want for this BRI to have the securitized, or they do not want to be engaged in any kind of conflict in the region, and to reduce in a complementary way other initiatives and to reduce the gaps that we have as countries. Thank you very much, Andres.
Muchas gracias, Andres. I don't know if Elena, would you like to comment? Do you have any comments, or Jeff? No, not so far. Well, we are almost in time. Unfortunately, there are some questions that are going to be kept for the next webinar on this topic. It seems like it has a lot to elaborate still, the many different aspects that have been tackled now, and maybe we could have talked a bit more, but well, we'll leave it for the next time. I would like now to give the floor to the president of the Asia-Pacific Foundation, Jeff Nankivel, to give the closing remarks, together with thanking all of you, Jeff, Elena, and Andres, for this excellent presentation. Jeff, do you have the floor, please?
Thank you very much, Loreta, and thank you to all the panelists for a really good discussion that I think got us into the issues in a very productive way and left us lots of threads for further research and discussion. And that's the kind of thing that we look for in our business. I think it would be hard to sum it up, to do it justice in summing it up, but I'm grateful to Andres Borges for setting the stage, for describing to us the BRI, situating it in a holistic context, shedding light on its aspects of its integrated nature, and also its continuity with the past. So this is not something that has arisen out of nothing. And then Jeff Reeves expanded on this in a very helpful way, I thought, by elaborating on the international views, different viewpoints on the BRI. I'll come back to that in a second in my closing remarks, but very usefully describing findings on the regional perspectives on the BRI around the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific regions. And I think a really important message for us to carry forward, which is the need to engage in regional activities and initiatives for those who want to not just participate, but also to be able to have a say on the way these things are evolving. And then Alina, as always, very insightful comments, deepening the discussion on the regional perspectives, and on the fact that those in the region, and particularly in ASEAN, which is a focus for the work of these webinars, have their own plans. And I'm really struck by the need for us sitting on this side of the Pacific, Northern and Southern Hemisphere, to take account of the fact that no one is standing still just watching the US and China compete. Everyone is getting on with their lives, and everyone in the region has their own plans and ambitions and needs and perspectives. If I can wrap up in terms of the overall discussion, there may be some in the audience who feel that not enough airtime was given to criticisms of the Belt and Road Initiative. I would point out, I think Jeff spent a few minutes summarizing those very well, but I think it's also important to take into account that I think for this audience, we started with a familiarity of the major criticisms of the BRI, seen as a kind of a geopolitical play by China, and that where we felt we could really shed light in the discussion was to bring other perspectives to bear. That's not to say that those criticisms do not exist, and I think there are issues for us all to look at going forward. I think we didn't really get into it in the discussion, but the risk of corruption in projects and initiatives that take place in a manner that is not always fully transparent. This is something that's not unique to projects involving China. We have long experience of this in other parts of the world. But it's an issue, I think, that arises when we look at BRI initiatives. And as was pointed out by the speakers, obviously not all BRI initiatives are the same. They involve different institutions, they involve different kinds of deals, but there are things to look at there. The impact of projects and initiatives on human rights in the places where they are taking place. These are things that anyone doing infrastructure projects needs to look at very carefully. And I think the point that I would carry forward on this is that for those of us who have such concerns about massive amounts of investment going out in this way, that we can raise these issues, but we can only do so productively if we engage in the institutions, in the events, in the discussions in the region, and if we are fully listening and taking into account the perspectives of all the players in the region. So with that, I would like to thank for his introductory remarks, Ignacio Tonero, Andres Borges, Jeff Reeves, Elena Noor for wonderful presentations and for answering many questions. And finally, and very importantly, our partner in the Southern Hemisphere, Loreta Leighton. Thank you so much, Loreta. It's been a pleasure joining this seminar series. And from the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, we look forward to continuing to develop this partnership. There's a lot of rich work for us to do. And thank you, all of you who have participated. We look forward to continued engagement with you. Have a good day.